Cameron Joseph is Washington bureau chief for the New York Daily News. He joins us now from Washington to talk about some of the details we just heard from the president there. And first, I want to get your sense on the overall way this budget is being sold. An increase in defense spending, and he said to domestic federal agents. But in a call with the Office of Management and Budget with reporters today, a backgrounder on how this will be done, we've learned that foreign aid is likely to be drastically reduced in order to pay for it. What do you make of what's being increased and decreased in this plan?
Well, they're talking about a huge shift in the way that the government does business. They said on that call I was on, $54 billion shift. That's a big injection into the Pentagon, which is already receiving about half of discretionary spending from the government is already going to the military. And it's about roughly a 10% reduction in overall domestic spending, doing some back of the envelope math here. So that's a big difference in how the government's going to operate. And it sounds like the EPA is the first on the chopping block in terms of where that money is going to come out of. Also, State Department's going to lose some of that money. We were talking about foreign aid spending. That's only 1% of the budget. So unless you take that all the way to zero, it really isn't going to make that much of a difference at the end of the day, but it really could cause some problems internationally. So it's going to be interesting to see. You know, we're just talking about vague outlines of a blueprint. They're saying they're going to push this, you know, they're going to give every agency a chance to defend what they're getting, and then come back in a couple weeks with the actual blueprint. But right now, this is looking like A, what Donald Trump promised on the campaign trail, and B, a dramatic restructuring in how government spending is going to operate, and it could really do a lot of damage to a lot of domestic programs. The two that are accepted here, Medicare and Social Security, which Donald Trump promised to leave alone, but a lot of other things are going to take a big hit, it looks like.
So one of the other things that he talked about was a rise in infrastructure spending. I'm sure the Democratic governors in the audience probably like that, but let's take a listen to what he had to say.
We're going to start spending on infrastructure big, and not like we have a choice. It's not like, oh, gee, let's hold it off. Our highways, our bridges are unsafe, so we have to fix our infrastructure. It's not like we have a choice. We have no choice, and we're going to do it, and it also happens to mean jobs, which is a good thing.
Okay, so I mentioned the Democrats may like it. Something that Errol and I were talking about is perhaps not so much the Republicans. What do you make of what he had to say?
Well, I think that it's definitely the area that President Trump and Democrats have the most agreement on, and creates some of the biggest tensions between him and his own party. It's going to be really interesting to see whether this actually happens, because Republicans control Congress, both the House and Senate. And, you know, Senator Schumer, the head of the Senate Democrats, has talked about working with Donald Trump. Even Bernie Sanders has talked about working with Donald Trump right now. But honestly, it doesn't seem like it's that high a priority for the White House right now. They talk about that after some of the much bigger things that they're trying to do, repeal and replace Obamacare, and they still don't have any real plan, at least that we've seen, on how to do that. Major tax reforms, which is one of those other things that's a lot easier said than done. We haven't seen it successfully done in about 30 years. And then they kind of mentioned this infrastructure package. And so I think it's one of those things that could get some bipartisan agreement, especially if Donald Trump decides to make this a priority. The big question is whether he's going to make it that a priority, and we haven't really seen whether or not this is just a talk here or whether they're really going to start a bipartisan effort that could alienate some Republicans on this.
Now, Congress people are returning to work after spending some time in their hometowns, speaking to constituents who at town halls have grilled them over health care. Let's just listen to what the president said on the increasing popularity of the Affordable Care Act.
You have to do what's right, because Obamacare is a failed disaster. And it's interesting. It's sort of like when you see it with politicians. You see it with President Obama. When you know he's getting out of office and the clock is ticking and he's not going to be there, his approval rating goes way up. Even though, you know, not that active in the last period of time, the approval rating goes up. That's not him. That's like almost everybody. I see it happening with Obamacare. People hate it. But now they see that the end is coming, and they're saying, oh, maybe we love it. There's nothing to love. It's a disaster, folks, okay? So you have to remember that.
So a tacit acknowledgement that the popularity of Obamacare is and has been increasing, but the president doesn't seem to want to change his mind on repealing and reforming it. Should he?
Well, I think the devil's in the details on this. Republicans have talked ever since this passed about repealing and replacing Obamacare. And they've passed a couple of versions of what that could look like in the House and Senate, but that was before it was ever any chance of that actually being reality, because President Obama was still President Obama. Now they're actually having to grapple with the reality that this has greatly expanded health care for a lot of people, that a lot of changes would throw some people off of health care. Obviously, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, is not working very well in certain parts of the economy. It hasn't really done enough to bend the cost curve in a lot of people's eyes. But any fixes are pretty difficult to sell right now, and they're having a lot of trouble getting on the same page with what those changes would actually look like. So they're all saying, oh yeah, we're going to have no problem doing this. But internally, especially the congressional Republicans are saying that they really are grappling with this and they haven't come up with a clear plan yet.
You know, when the president was talking to the governors last night at the dinner, one of the things that he said was that we've accomplished almost everything that we set out to accomplish in the first 4 weeks. And you can't help but to wonder, we've got a travel ban that's being, that's tied up in courts. The wall, we still really don't know who's going to pay for it. The Affordable Care Act, we still don't know what actually is going to be replacing it, even though there's a lot of talk about it. We've got a great plan in the works. What do you make of that statement that we pretty much accomplished everything we set out to do?
Well, it's clear, in my mind, it's been a very chaotic first month. They've done a lot of things. Some of them haven't done much. Some of them have done a lot very rapidly and created some chaos, especially if you look at the travel and refugee ban that's now being held up in the courts and working through that. Over there, they're talking about putting out another plan. They promised that they were going to put a new travel ban that would be constitutional and wouldn't have a problem in the courts. They said they were going to release that last week. We're still waiting on that. Obamacare was supposed to be an easy fix that Donald Trump kept claiming. They haven't really moved very far at all on that. I think that President Trump is realizing that things are a little harder to change in D.C. Than he predicted on the campaign trail. At the same time, there's a lot of legitimate frustration from the White House saying, no matter what we do, everybody's bashing us. And I understand that frustration, and we're only a month in, but it's going to be really interesting to see how much of this they're actually able to accomplish. And I think a lot of folks who are new to the White House, and some of them are new to Washington, especially the president, are a little surprised at how slow the pace is and why that pace is so slow around here. I think people forget that the system is essentially built to make things as hard as possible to get done, to try and avoid big mistakes. And right now, I think we're seeing some of those checks and balances really stymie a president who's used to being a businessman and signing a piece of paper and having everything shift.
Right. Cameron Joseph of the New York Daily News, we really appreciate your time, Cameron.
Thanks for having me.